Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Fantasy Book Critics, Authors, and Their Favorite Books video interview series. Today, joining us is Michael R. Fletcher, indie grimdark darling. That's one of the words you can use to describe him. Another quality of his is that he's the only person that I know of who has appeared in 2 consecutive SPFPO finals. The first one was with his book, oh dear God, and I'm blanking out. Blackstone Heart, was Blackstone Heart in last year's finals. And this year he has co-authored a book called Norilska Groans with Clayton Snyder. As far as I know, that is a very unique achievement, but there's a lot more. So Michael, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm good. Hey, thanks for inviting me on. This is great. I do love talking about my favorite books.
Awesome. So, well, with that being said, which is the title that you have chosen to talk about today, and can you tell us a little bit about what makes it such a favorite of yours?
Okay, so I mean, it's the book is called Wizard War. It's the first book in a series by Hugh Cook. Unfortunately, I believe Hugh Cook passed on before he finished the series. There are quite a few books in this series, but for me, it was really Wizard War, the very first book, which kind of massively shaped my concept of what fantasy could be. And there are obviously I'm a huge Michael Moorcock Stormbringer fan, but everybody knows those books. Everybody knows Stormbringer. No one ever talks about Hugh Cook. No one ever talks about this book. And to me, that's a shame. People are missing some incredible fantasy.
Interesting. And I believe these were books which came out in the early 80s, if I'm not wrong, and they continued for the whole, there's a 10-book series, which is, I believe it's titled Chronicle of an Age of Darkness. Is that the title?
Yep.
You mentioned that, that they're everyone hears about Michael Moorcock and, all of his Elric Melniboné and all of this multiverse books that he has written, because technically all of his books are set in the same multi-universe or universes, so as to speak. With these books, when you say that they are not as famous as they should be, in what regard do you mean? Do you in regards to the writing, in regards of do they have something special within them? What is it that you think is it so?
Yeah. I've read the Wizard War a couple of times, but honestly not in a decade or more. I tried to find my old copy to do a quick reread before this, but I lent it to a friend and we just weren't able to sort of cross paths again, before we did this. So I'm leaning on my memory, which is pretty bad. I can't really comment on the prose because I read it sort of back in high school, the late 80s.
Yeah.
But it stuck with me. To me, the reason this book is sort of worth reading for any fantasy writer is the world building and the magic. And in a time when we were looking at so many Lord of the Rings clones, I won't name them. They were cranking them out and they were super popular, right? There's a ton of them. They're all getting TV shows now. Hugh Cook did something different. To me, it felt like he leaned into the gaming side of it. It was sort of one of the first what we call hard magic systems these days, where there were rules. And now he didn't go into vast detail spelling them out, but there were things mentioned wizards meditated to store power. And some of the older wizards would grumble about, spending 100 years locked up in some tower meditating, all to have it sort of wasted in this brief battle with a dragon that ends up flying off anyway. And they're like, oh, hundreds of years of meditation. That hurts. I thought that was really cool. And then there's the magic system and very defined spells. And you've got wizards, you've got apprentices who are in their 30s and, master mages who are 800, 900 years old, and a world of magic and magical items. And which, he did some really cool stuff with magic bottles, where there were entire like large homes inside a magic bottle, and you'd have a ring, and that would, if you put the ring on, it would pop you into the bottle. And it's filled with like stores and bedrooms, and that there's this whole sort of like pocket universe in this bottle, and you have all your supplies and stuff in there. But then there are traps in there, and then somebody finds a magic bottle within the bottle, and and it's like it gets nuts, and it's so well done. And then the actual world building, without going into too much detail, and he plays it just right. He doesn't sort of like force it down your throat. They're just hints of it. But this is a world where the mountains are alive. And you're going to see, you will probably notice some similarities. His stuff was massively influential on me for the Obsidian Path books. I love the idea. Now I sort of like pushed it farther because that's always what I want to try and do. But there were scenes where wizards would wake up a mountain and go rampaging across the landscape on this screaming mountain. And I was like, a 15, 16-year-old kid, I'm like, yes, this is magic. None of this, I've got a spell and I'm gonna tug on my braid and follow a river somewhere, and nothing's gonna happen for 7 books. Like, it's one book, and it's a good size book, and it's dense. A lot of shit happens.
It is. Wow. Okay. That was, and I can totally see your point, because what you just described at that time, that was unheard of. I'll go ahead and say it. I'm pretty. I know, as you correctly mentioned, there's a lot of Tolkien knockoffs. Terry Brooks, I'm sure he will admit his first book, because of his editorial input, seemed very much like a condensation of the Lord of the Rings. But after that, his next edition, the remaining Shannara book series, were very popular, as were a lot of other series as well. You had, David Eddings and also, but yeah, compared to what you just described, they sound a little bit milquetoast, because this was light years ahead of its time in regards to what it was doing. Also, just, this whole thing which you mentioned, about the wizards meditating and storing up power, for hundreds of years and then having to use it. That sounds a little bit like what we have, at least what I have read in Hindu mythology, like, the sages, so to speak, we used to call them rishis. They would, oftentimes keep on meditating and praying to whichever god they wanted. And at the end of it, the god would grant them a boon. But at the same time, because of their harsh meditations, no eating, no sleeping, everything, they would kind of gain these powers. And the gods, there was one cruel god king, like, who's the Zeus archetype. He would kind of send these beautiful nymphs to kind of distract them. And if they did get distracted, they would be in the same position. They'd be like, oh shit, 50 on the drain. And now I have to start all over again. So invariably, there'd be a lot of cursing and real curses as well. Yeah. Thank you for that. And we'll get back to the magic system in just a little bit. I do want to ask you, was this your introduction to Hugh Cook's books, or did you do something else before this one?
Yeah, that was my introduction to Hugh Cook stuff. I don't know how much else he wrote. I remember like years and years ago looking for stuff. I haven't finished all of the what was it, Age of Darkness, I think, right?
Yep, Chronicle of Age of Darkness.
I didn't finish the whole series. For my tastes, Wizard War was kind of like the pinnacle of it. He sort of veered off into this slightly more comedic fantasy feel, which it's just not my thing. There are great series out there that I can't read because for me, fantasy is not about comedy. And it's not sort of denigrating that idea. I know a ton of people love it, but I like it. I like it dark. I like my Stormbringer.
Yeah, it's a personal preference of yours. It's completely fine. It's like people who love romantic fantasy or comedic fantasy, they can read it, and the writers who write that, it's just not for a certain bunch of people. You're not, and I totally see your point. Like, if you have a set preference, it's up to you whether you want to try it or if you don't want to try it. No, nobody's blaming you for that. That was actually going to be my next question. If you had read the remaining books in the Chronicle of Age of Darkness, because it was 10 books long. I did want to maybe talk about a little bit of this comedic tone that you said that you found in later books, because the first book was kind of like, I mean, yes, it had its moments of dark humor, but it wasn't comedy fantasy. It was more, I don't think the grimdark term was into it, but it was definitely darker fantasy with splashes of humor here and there. kind of akin to Glenn Cook. But do you think maybe it was his publisher who kind of wanted, because everybody was really with the name as well, the Wizard War, and I believe it was retitled something else as well. I think it was also called the Wizard and Warriors in some editions. But do you think maybe it's his publishers who kind of told him like, okay, calm down, we don't want this darker stuff, we want you to kind of go with the more comedic level stuff?
Yeah, I mean that I can't really comment on. For me it was a jarring change of direction, which threw me off, and it wasn't somewhere where I was kind of interested in going at the time. It was still like thick with ideas, and he was trying new stuff, and like I get that. To me it seems unlikely that his publisher pushed him to do it. Publishers, in my extremely limited experience, with basically just 2 trad books, publishers are kind of, for the most part, they want you to write the book. Write the book you want to write a good book. And dark or not, they're like, just write a good book, okay? And at the time, this is like Stormbringer, that stuff was huge too. So it's not like there was no dark fantasy. I think C.S. Friedman's
I think she was a little bit later than them.
Was she a little bit later?
Yeah, just a little bit, just 3 or 4 years later when her first book came out. But Glenn Cook was there on the same time. Black Company was around late 80s, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
But so yeah, I mean, I see. I'm just thinking out loud because, and this is just a supposition based on what was popular back then. Darker fantasies were not as. I mean, yes, Michael Moorcock, he was kind of like an enigma back then. He was the other British writer who was so famous, but of course not as famous as Tolkien. And all of the American writers, maybe besides Glenn Cook, were kind of writing mainstream fantasy, which was not comedic, but was on the slightly lighter side. And of course, getting more and more epic with all of the gnomes, dwarves, elves, and God knows every other race that Tolkien ever invented. So that's why, just a supposition, but completely understandable where you're coming from. I apologize for this. I know you mentioned that you kind of haven't read it in the last, they're going back off your recollection, but did you feel that his writing was pretty different from what you had read before, or like pretty different from what was being published in the fantasy genre back then?
Yeah, he had a neat way of introducing characters. Like when he launched right away, when the book started, each time a character showed up, you got this almost like very brief point form description. Like Myphon, apprentice wizard, 37 years old, likes the color green, specializes in plant magic. And each time, and including like the donkey got one as well. They, I think they had this grumpy donkey or something, and that was just different. Unfortunately, I don't remember the prose well enough, but certainly, I mean, even then I was a picky bastard. There were an awful lot of books which are now super famous, which I couldn't read because I was just like, this is so fucking badly written. I can't do it. And they all have TV series now, so they're massively popular. But Hugh Cook stuff, for me, it was pretty seamless. For high school Mike.
High school Mike. And it's completely fair because, well, and let's be fair, all those TV shows, they aren't really popular. Like they flame out within 1 to 2 seasons, and they are now considered like I want to say worst of the worst, but they're definitely up there in in terms of IMDb ratings of being one of the worst fantasy shows, or some of the worst fantasy shows ever made. And yeah, there's that. I do want to talk to you a little bit about the cover, because I don't know which cover you got, but there is one epically bad cover of like a wizard who's like a half worm. And when and the reason why I mentioned this is because I remember you had specifically mentioned this book in one of your podcast episodes of Wizards, Warriors, and Words. Shout out to Jed and to all 3 of you. But I remember you folks were talking about something, and you specifically brought up this book. And both Lucas and me, because we listened around the same time, we were looking up this book, and I think we kind of saw the cover at the same time, and we messaged it and didn't Mike talk about?
Okay, is this he's like a think he's wearing green or something. He's
Yes,
got kind of a
yes,
wizard's hat,
yeah.
and
And
he's
then
so he's not a worm.
oh,
That's smoke coming out of a bottle. So he is coming out of a bottle inside of another bottle.
okay,
And he's doing something with a ring on his finger in the picture, I think. So
gotcha.
he is
Okay,
twisting the ring on his finger, and he's exiting one bottle and sort of reforming into another bottle. That is the cover I had.
okay, yeah. So
Yeah.
here's the thing. Okay, the reason why it looked like a worm, and I'll try to post the picture within this video as well, somewhere over here or here. But okay, and of course, this is back from all, before the advent of ebooks, all the covers were blown up. They look better in the bigger format. This was a thumbnail we were seeing on our phones, most likely. So
Yeah.
it literally looks as if because the background is green. There's like a wizard with, with a hat and typical, or like kind of like a, I want to say like Middle Eastern maybe wizard with like you're right. He kind of looks like almost like a djinn or something like that. But then the lower part of it, it almost like it curves along and it kind of seemed like a snake. And we were both thinking like, this is like, not just we were talking about the cover, that this cover was horrendous. There's a different cover, which is a much better cover. But like, this cover, that's what I want to ask you, because it's like, when people look at the thumbnail for that, they're more likely to be repulsed by that rather than even want to go and look inside. So
yeah, it's clearer when you actually have the the paperback. You're looking at the cover, you can tell that it's smoke and stuff. Yeah, it's classic 80s cover. You either dig that kind of that vibe, or or it doesn't work for you. I know it's kind of mostly fallen out of favor, although I think it's sneaking back, because certainly that's what I do. All my covers, when I get Felix to do stuff, it's like big monsters, cool magic, dude with sword. Like you can kind of see some of that going on there.
Oh yeah, and for our viewers, that was a quick peek at An End to Sorrow. The cover artist is Felix Ortiz, acclaimed artist for Michael R. Fletcher and for Rob J. Hayes and for many, many, many other indie and small published authors. I do want to ask you about your personal preference, though. Did you like? I mean, I completely understand. With Felix's covers and even with your previous artist John Anthony Di Giovanni, they're both fantastic artists. Like even if they're paying homage to the 80s, 70s art, their artwork is, while being stylistically the same, it is mind-blowing. Did you like those covers? Like, because I mean, there are some covers which are good, but a lot of 80s covers were just awful. I mean, again, my opinion.
Yeah. It was very different. Like at the time, I loved those covers. Michael Willin, who did like Memory Sore on Thorn. Michael Willin was I think peaking at that time. He was doing a ton of super cool fantasy cover art. So there's some of it's better than others. And I'm going off my memories for the Wizard War cover. I don't remember hating it. And I think it's one of those where after you've read the book, you go, oh, that's that scene. I'm like, oh, that's cool. And the description fits, like it's that wizard from the book. And you're like, that's with the bottles, and it all makes sense. If you haven't read the book, you're like, what the fuck is going on?
That's true. And and to your point, Michael Willin, it was definitely coming up huge. He did the covers for, I think, the early, he did the covers for the Coldfire trilogy. He did the covers mentioned for the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn trilogy or series by Tad Williams. And then I think he did some of the early Robert Jordan covers for Wheel of Time as well, if I'm not wrong. I might be wrong, but I just
could be.
There was Sanderson referencing him for that. So his artwork, I would say, is definitely cool. Like, his Coldfire trilogy covers are just mind blowing, and you very rightly they say that they focus on the characters and maybe certain events within the book. So, okay, I hear you on that. Coming back to Wizard War, one of the reviews which I read specifically mentioned that it's because this review was done much later, as I think the last few years. The reviewer kind of made a mention of that this is actually a typical grimdark story with like ruthless soldiers, psychopathic monarchs, like near immortal, because I think the first line of the book is like the wizard which is mentioned with the P, whose name starts with the P, is like nearly 5,000 plus years old, who have slightly twisted morals. Like they're not, I don't want to call them insane, but their morality after a period of time has been stretched to near inhuman standards. So what would you say? Like, of course, the term has come up so recently, but would you call it a grimdark novel? Would you say it's
now, I wouldn't call it grimdark. I mean, it's become very popular to sort of posthumously label things grimdark.
Mhm.
I kind of tend not to do that because I'm like, yeah, grimdark wasn't a thing back then. Let's not sort of like
Yeah.
change what it was. Um, it wasn't epic fantasy quite because it's not large scale. You
Mhm.
know, it's not about saving the world, as I remember, which
Mhm.
barely
Well,
remember. But it's
it
there's
starts. Yeah.
yeah, there's you know, there is a quest, there are things they have to do, and then you know the party sort of falls apart, and it is dark and violent. But then I mean, so is all fantasy, really. I mean, if it's not at least a little dark and a little violent, it's probably pretty boring, you know.
Okay.
And
Fair
but
enough.
like some of the characters sort of switch sides, as I recall, and
Mhm.
you know, there's sort of a you know a chase to capture people, and so it you know it is dark and violent, but I don't remember it being sort of certainly not over the top dark. Like
Mhm.
I recall, I think of Stormbringer
Yeah.
as being you know a darker series of books. Glenn Cook, you know
Mhm.
the Black Company stuff, you know that being sort of a darker as well.
Okay. And that's fair. I completely hear you on that. Do you find it funny that people now talk about George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire being like labeled as grimdark? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, like I read the first book back in crap, was it like 95 or something like that? Like
oh,
nobody had heard of it. It was, you know, it was just like
yeah.
a new fantasy book. Read the first one, thought it was just amazing. Read the second one, thought it was a huge turd. Read the third one, and it was like, oh shit, it's really good again. You know, and at that point, you know, it sort of stuff started slowing down, got busy with, you know, life and stuff.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I personally, I don't like, you know, changing labels on stuff.
Mhm.
I don't see Game of Thrones as grimdark myself, although I get why people would call it that.
Yeah.
To me, it's just sort of a like large scale, like epically large scale fantasy. But
Mhm.
eh,
Yeah. I know. I mean, because it is kind of confusing because like you rightly mentioned, it's large scale epic fantasy with like really darker elements and some horrific scenes. And of course, he kind of like I don't want to say started, but it almost became popularized the whole killing of main characters or like really maiming them in such horrible ways that people were traumatized. And of course, the TV series now has made it like as you know, and everybody knows, the Game of Thrones, it was like a big thing, like who's going to die next. Of course, the book readers already knew about it, but the TV viewers probably didn't. And so for them, it was like, oh, this is something totally new. I completely hear you on that, and I was just curious about that because for me, it's like you're like you correctly mentioned, like grimdark kind of. I think it originated in the late 2010s. Definitely in the early like from 2010 onwards, it was kind of like becoming a huge thing.
yeah,
You are considered one of the progenitors of the whole grimdark genre.
which is that's
Likewise.
it's very strange to me.
It is,
Like
but let's
I
be
wrote
honest.
yeah, I wrote I wrote a Beyond Redemption in
Mhm.
2009. Landed an agent with it in 2013, I think.
Mhm.
And you know, as I've said before, like she said, "Oh, the grimdark crowd is going to love this,"
Mhm.
and I had no idea what she was talking about. Like, I'd never heard the term. I had to Google it after talking to her. I had no idea what she was on about.
Oh wow.
Now
Okay.
later, and the book like flopped huge. Nobody bought it at first.
Mhm.
It was like it's only years later the grimdark crowd kind of you know, I think they adopted me,
Mhm.
which is it's kind of the only reason I have a you know career is because the grimdark crowd of like he's fucked up. I like him.
Well, I would disagree with on this because I think you're giving yourself less credit. I'm not talking about the success of the financial success of the book Beyond Redemption, but I distinctly remember Anthony Ryan reaching out to us and telling us that hey, there's this new author. And I believe he had blurred Beyond Redemption. Like there's this new author. You folks have to check this book out, and it's going to be huge. The reason why I asked about this whole grimdark thing is because I distinctly remember Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire came around like right around 2010, and the
Mhm.
next big thing which kind of landed on our pile, which was considered like an equivalent to that, was your book Beyond Redemption. Of course, there was like others and others, like Luke Skull came up with his Grim Company, but it was kind of like an odd mixture of like grimdark, but also epic fantasy, and with small smidges of like heroic fantasy as well. But yeah, after like Joe Abercrombie, because after what he did in 2006, beginning of his first law trilogy, there's nothing else. But Mark Lawrence is like the best next name. You say you're adopted. I think you are kind of like you did something really good in traditional publishing. Then you kind of made on the indie switch, and that was of course, like you have your fans, they'll speak more about it as well. I count myself as a latecomer or to your books, so my apologies for that. But Lucas is like really huge, like really huge fan of yours. So he's been like constantly telling me like, I need to start on the City of Sacrifice books. I think I read half of the first one, but I could not. I haven't finished it, and something else came up, SPFPO and something like that. So I kind of got left over the wayside. But I need to start with it as well. But yeah. Considering your grimdark status, considering you have now definitely written quite a few books, would you feel comfortable to, or basically say that, you know, that grimdark is kind of on the wane, or is it's still going on? It's just that, you know, of course, due to the pandemic and everything, now people are just talking less about it.
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know. I think I suspect that grimdark as a sort of a genre and the books that are getting, you know, lumped in there fairly or unfairly, I think that might be sort of on the wane a bit. But I think overall the tone of a lot of fantasy has gotten a bit darker anyway. And so the line is more blurred. You know, like nobody calls Malazan grimdark, and yet, you know, it fits a lot of the sort of the definitions. You know, and if you like hardcore Malazan fans, I think if you call it grimdark, they get a little upset. They're like, no, it's not grimdark, it's something else. You know, and then we're going back and we're calling old just dark fantasy stuff, we're calling that grimdark now. You know, like, yeah, it was just dark fantasy before. I don't know. Whatever's going on, it doesn't seem to be hurting me. Now I'm on the tiny little indie scene, so you know, I think sort of either I've found my niche or the readers of that have found me. And that doesn't mean that doesn't sort of equate to success on a traditional publishing level. I mean, we're talking orders of magnitude difference. So I think you look at the people who were writing, the big grimdark writers, you know, with the sort of like the peak, Mark Lawrence, Joe Abercrombie. They haven't written grimdark in quite a long time. They've been putting out other stuff, and that's been doing really well for them. So yeah, I think it wouldn't be unfair to say that is less popular than it was.
Yeah, okay, I completely hear you on that. And you're right about Mark Lawrence, because yeah, Mark Lawrence started out grimdark, then he did like 2 trilogies and slowly kind of made the switch towards epic, but still darker fantasy. He even slipped in like I think his Impossible Times trilogy, which is like with Amazon Publishing. It was a whole different, I don't want to call it lit RPG, but it had like lit RPG like elements, and yeah, it was a completely different thing. Joe Abercrombie though kind of has still, you know, with his release, I don't know if you read his most recent books, the recent trilogy. Okay. It's set in the same world, just again, not a spoiler, but just set in the same world a few maybe decades after like the first trilogy and the standalone books. It still has elements of those. And of course now, I think last week found out that he has signed on for a new trilogy, not new trilogy, sorry, a new series that is set in a new world, which is going to be spies, Europe, like old clandestine Europe. And of course, this is, I'm talking about more like 16th to 18th century and maybe empires or something like that. So that's interesting to see where and what he does with that.
Yeah, cool.
All right. Sorry, getting back to Wizard War. I apologize. I keep getting distracted. The book series, what I read, you know, about it was that, you know, basically, of course, you know, it had like this morning sales and everything, which is why it kind of got capped at like 10 books. He originally was planning to have like, you know, it was originally supposed to be 20 books long, and then kind of it ballooned to maybe 60 books. And there's going to be 3 like major chronicles. Like the first one was Chronicles of Age of Darkness. Second was the Chronicles of Age of Rat. And the last was Chronicles of Age of Heroes. Did you know about this? Did you like, as a fan, did you have more knowledge about this one? What was all about, or what was
so like years later, years after I actually read the first book, I learned about that. And I do remember sort of researching him, like reading all his wiki stuff, and kind of, you know, at that point, I think he was still alive at the time, although like not physically doing well. and wasn't he was no longer publishing books traditionally. I think he may have kind of like early self-published a couple of pieces. This is going back. So I mean, it's an insane idea. I mean, I can't, for me, a trilogy, I'm like, God damn, trilogy is like a lot of work. 3 books, like holy crap. To be thinking like 10 or 30 or 60 books in the future is nuts. I do wish he had been given the chance to do it though. I think he had some really cool ideas, and he was willing to push some boundaries and sort of try a few different things.
That definitely would. I often wonder about, with stuff like this, when you hear about like, the traditionally published authors like having to drop their plans or not being able to do stuff. Maybe, of course, considering now with the ease of which indie publishing is still available, if they would have been able to do so, and if so, what would their careers have been like? I don't know if you know about this, but Jesse Teller, another indie author, I don't know if you've heard of him.
Oh yeah,
his grand plan of, I think, 68 or so books, and he had once told me, and it blew my mind, and I was telling him like, my God, dude, this is like really awesome, but also mind-boggling. Like, how do you even plan for it? And he's like, no, it's been all in my head, and I just have to write it out now. So I was like, okay, kudos to you, because I mean, even as a reader, that's like it's like 68 books worth of stuff, and you have to read it all. It's I don't know. You mentioned like you were feeling anxious about writing more than a trilogy. What would you feel, if somebody tells you like, oh yeah, there's like a 60-book series which you will like, but you have to read all the 60. Would you do it?
Read all 60? Oh my God. Probably not. I mean, more on the writer side, my fear with writing stuff longer than a trilogy is like twofold. One, are people actually clearly going to remember the early stuff later to the point where it'll actually have any impact? And if not, then I'm like, what's the point? And also just maintaining readership. I mean, the reality is you write a book. Let's say it's super popular. The thing is, even if people love it, not everybody who reads the first book is going to buy the second book. And so the sales of your second book, by definition, are always smaller than the first. Likewise, even if the second book is amazing, fewer people are going to then buy the third book. And that continues. And if you look at that, over a 60-book stretch, like I think by my 60th book, like even my mom would be like, yeah, I'm not buying this. Now maybe if they're sort of like, if there are break points where you don't have to read stuff that came before, or I love the idea, and Lawrence Watt Evans does this really well, is writing in the same universe, but he writes like he's got however many standalones all written in the same universe. I think that's brilliant. Saves you on having to do world building over and over again, although that part is kind of fun. But I could never I wouldn't read a 60-book series. I can't imagine it, holding my interest that long. And I certainly wouldn't write one because the idea scares the crap out of me. But Jesse is like full on crazy. And if anybody can pull it off, it's him.
I'm rooting for him. I believe so are you, and as are most of the people who have read it. At least listen to him, because he's deeply invested in his world. I'm forgetting the name of his world, which is so awful. It starts with a P, but it's never mind. It'll come to me later. Thank you for that. I do want to talk a little bit before about the rest of the series as well. I don't know. I apologize if you haven't, I don't remember how much you read it, but in another of the reviews of the series review, which was talking about some of the later books do this really cool feature of, they talk about similar scenes but from different perspectives or different character perspectives, and that apparently throws the whole scene and the whole story in like a whole different, it puts it on a different path. Did you come across this portion of the story?
Yeah, I don't remember that. I'm trying. I think I read the first 3 books, but I mean, this is I reread the first book a couple of times, so I have slightly better memory of what went on there. But book 2 and 3, I don't think I ever reread them. I remember very little of them.
That's fair. That's absolutely okay, and no worries at all. Just for our viewers, I think the first 3 books which Michael's mentioning are The Wizards and Warriors, also known as Wizard War. The second book is called The Wordsmiths and War Guild. And the third book is Women and Warlords. This series also did something funny, like on the US side, I believe the first book, of course, had a different name with Wizard War and the Wizards and Warriors. But I think book 2 was broken down into 2 books. And then book 3 was kind of also broken down to, so there's something like I was looking up in preparation for this interview, and there's like, it kind of lists 2 different series, but then they're technically the same series, but just in one book has been broken down into 2. So did you happen to like come across those, or did you get to read the full edition, which was like
no, I think I had I think that means technically I probably only read the second book, because the ones I read were pretty small, they were pretty thin.
Oh, so would that be the Questing Hero and Hero's Return?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay. So there's this really weird thing which they did, when I only found out because I was digging deep. I was like, why are there 2 series with the same name? So apparently, the Questing Hero and this one, the Hero's Return, are kind of like the 2 books just made out of the one book, which is the Wordsmiths and War Guild. So there we go. Publishers doing their best.
Sneak more money out of the audience.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't mind that if they would kind of just, like, if they had kept it better, like, if the knowledge of it was better spread out, like, okay, there's just, this is the same book, but this is like 2 books. It's okay. It's if they do that. All right. Lastly, is there like, and I'll end with this. You definitely do love this book because, it made an impression on you when you read it, when you're 15, 16 years old. It still comes to your mind often because you have mentioned, as I mentioned before, like you mentioned it on the Wizards, Warriors, and Words podcast. If you had to tell, newer readers or just people who are listening to this and your fans, if they want to give it a try, what would you say, like, why they should, like, because of course now there's like a wealth of options for everybody to read, and even books. You have an upcoming book coming out soon. If you haven't pre-ordered it, folks, you should do so. It's amazing. Michael, thanks for the ARC. But just with regards to Wizard War, why would you say, would it be worth a reader's time to check it out?
Yeah, I mean, it might come off a little dated now. I can't comment on that. But if you sort of if you want to see some early fantasy, relatively early, that was pushing boundaries a little bit, doing some neat stuff with magic, like one of these sort of early hard magic systems, and just an inventive writer who was sort of willing to sort of run with ideas. I think it's great for that. And for anyone who's like an actual like Fletcher fan, if you want to see where like one of the books where I'm like definitely stealing ideas from, I think it's definitely worth checking out.
Okay. So that is perfect. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me about this book, and because it's it has made such a pivotal mark on you. Now I do want to talk a little bit more about some of your other favorites, and maybe talking about this whole multiversal aspect, because this book, the series has that aspect. You mentioned Michael Moorcock, Stormbringer, and of his other books as well. And as we have found out, with your several series, there's these small hints here and there, and some a little bit more than hints, that they might definitely be set on the same world. Different timelines, maybe, different geographical locations for sure, but they are definitely set on the same world. Of course, now, thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Brandon Sanderson, the word universe just gets thrown out everywhere, and now everybody's clued in. But Michael Moorcock, if I'm not wrong, and please correct me if I am, I think was the first person who kind of literally did that. How?
Yeah, for me, that was definitely Michael Moorcock was the first fantasy writer that I saw doing that sort of, seemingly unrelated series, sharing some characters, sharing some background stuff. I mean, that for sure, that was my influence. That was always in the back of my head writing any of these books, and it's not a case of at no point am I planning on having everybody sort of run into the room together. It's much more like a background mythology. And some books are the history of another book, and it's not the order that they're written in at all. But I like, it's entertainment for myself, and to see how I can sort of like sneakily tie stuff together and then see if anyone notices.
Okay. I can tell you that Lucas does, because he had mentioned a couple of things, from the City of Sacrifice books, the name of the desert and everything, with the sand color and how it ties into, the Obsidian path. I also, I'm on your Patreon, and one of the things you have upcoming, and we'll talk about this, your newer series which is coming up, which is not about, the characters are not human, right? And if I'm not wrong, there was a small reference in the second book, She Dreams of Blood, about something flying up high, cities. And I was like, holy crap, that looks like what Michael's writing about now. And it kind of blew my mind as well. So kudos to you on that. Again, coming back to this whole multiversal aspect, like you mentioned, we are writing them purposefully not in a chronological order. And it's more so for the readers who want to read it, maybe go in depth, and they can get clues in. But why are you against such Avenger-style books where everyone comes together? Now, I'm kidding with this, because your characters are not the type of characters who would want to team up and fight a big evil. But just out of curiosity, would you be ever willing to write a book where some of them, at least the ones which are alive, staying and willing to work with other normalish people? Would that ever interest you as a writer?
Yeah. For me, like I honestly, I go wherever the story goes. I don't do a ton of plotting. I tend to I put more work into sort of understanding the world and how it's going to work. And then the characters and what happens, like, if you actually look at the plot of any of my books, they tend to be really, really simple. It's like thing happens, people react. And for me, like the characters kind of really decide the plot. So if things happen such that it makes sense, it could definitely happen.
Okay, fingers crossed. I'm just curious because it seems like you are kind of like the antithesis of the person who would like Marvel movies. Again, I don't mean any offense, but just like going from your reading style and from what sort of books and movies or like things that you like. So I was just curious. I'm just trying to see if that would ever be something on the horizon. But coming to the next one, I do want to talk to you about your upcoming book, An End to Sorrow. And it is the end to the Obsidian Path trilogy. You have completed it. The ARCs are out to the reviewers. Have you gotten any feedback from any, at least from, the hardcore fans who managed to get a copy about it?
Yep. So far, the feedback I've had has been really good. No one, and my fear, it's ending a series is terrifying. There are so many threads to wrap up. You want it to be satisfying, but you want to end on the right note as well, and it's just, from the first page of the first book, it's not going to end with everybody sort of getting together in a huge hug fest and it's all lived happily ever after. It's not going to happen. So endings are scary. So far, no one has said. My two fears were, one, the ending is going to suck and no one's going to be happy and they're going to be like, what the fuck were you thinking? Or that no one would understand it, because there is like a fair amount going on. So far, nobody has sort of come back and just said like, I didn't get it. So feedback has been extremely positive, which is really good. So I mean, it's still early yet. I've seen very few actual reviews so far. I think a lot of folks are sort of waiting until closer to release date to post. So for me, it's fingers crossed, and I hope people liked it.
I'm curious, because the reason why I asked you about this one, because technically, because you have a lot of books released, in a very weird way, you still have, this is kind of like the first time you have finished a trilogy. Again, no offense to you. I don't mean that as any, you finally finished.
No, it's true.
It is, because you have, the way the books, the Beyond Redemption series is, those are all more like standalone books. You also have the City of Sacrifice, which of course you do plan to write, but you're kind of pacing yourself as well. So because this was you kind of started out you got published in 2012, 2013, somewhere like that. So after 10 years, it's like when your first trilogy is kind of complete. So, I was kind of worried that there would be some anxiety on or in your mind as well. Of course, that, oh, have I stuck the landing? Like you mentioned, have I stuck the landing? And of course, the Obsidian Path trilogy is not for the faint-hearted. It has a character who loves a necromancer, and mild spoilers, is a person who's trying to get his own persona back via some really incredibly weird means. it's a hard trilogy to describe, and I'm guessing it was a harder trilogy for you to write. Would you say that was the case, or would you say that it would kind of flow?
Actually, these books were kind of weirdly easy.
Mm-hmm.
The third book was the hardest, just because I put so much pressure on myself for it to be, at a certain level. Hopefully I hit it. The first book, however, like fell out of me with almost no effort. I basically sat down and was like, he claws out of the dirt in this forest and there are little corpses everywhere, and go. And kind of everything after that, very little planning. I kind of knew maybe a chapter ahead, and I knew how I wanted it to end.
Oh wow. Okay. Well, it worked incredibly well, because the way for Blackstone Heart just expanded, and you're constantly on your toes, as was the main character. So it was perfect. All right. Let's talk a little bit about your upcoming work. Besides An End to Sorrow, you are currently writing a whole new series. For people who are on your Patreon, have kind of gotten glimpses of it. You have released some character sketches and stuff like that. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What's it about, and what will it be? Why do you write that?
Yep. Okay. So I'm actually currently writing 2 books. The last Manifest Illusions novel is half finished so far. We'll talk about that later maybe. But so I've got this new fantasy series I'm working on. I have a series name, but not a book name. The series is probably going to be called The Storm Beneath the World. And I wanted to do something really different. I wanted to totally escape European-based fantasy. And kind of it seemed like the way to do that was to just escape humans in general. And I had things I wanted to say about people, but the easiest way to do that sometimes is not to talk about people. And so I wanted to talk about sort of hive behavior. And that led me to insects. And I love praying mantises. I think they're super cool. And so I had this idea of writing a fantasy novel with, the characters are these sort of like huge predatory hive community praying mantises. I'm like, fuck yeah, that's already cool. And I'd also been playing around with this idea of non-human, like think like alien fantasy. So if there's an alien who's writing a fantasy book, what's it going to be like? And so I wanted to try and write an alien fantasy. So it happens on a world that's nothing like Earth. So I went back, did a ton of world building and research on mega gas giant planets, how the atmospheres work and stuff, and built a world where this fantasy novel is going to take place in the upper atmosphere of a mega gas giant planet. So I don't know why that was like, yes, I have to do this. And the more I thought about it, the more I had to, like, I didn't really have a choice. And so that was sort of like the beginning of the world building. The magic system, because of course, it's me. I'm like, I need a cool magic system. The magic system came out of it was kind of like an endorphin addiction. And you realize there are certain things you can do that just they feel really good. And like if you get enough cardio exercise, you can get that runner's high. And you want it again. And the same happens like for me, if I have a really good day of writing, it feels really good. Like there's a reason I'm still doing this after 10 years or whatever. I'm a junkie. So I've got this magic system based on people having talents, things that they get really good at, and the more they do them, the better they get, but the more they need to keep doing them. And so a talent can be anything from like making shoes or telling stories or causing things to burst into flame, and sort of more magical talents as well. So then this endorphin based magic system and these aliens, this sort of hive species, everything kind of clicked. And I had this idea to sort of tie it in with a bit of like elements of progression fantasy, a little bit of like hints of Blood Song. It's kind of like Bloodsong meets so Anthony Ryan's Bloodsong meets Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time.
Holy cow. Okay, that is a pretty unique blurb, so as to speak. So I mean, what you just described makes it sound unique on its own. Like I haven't heard of the only, and this is just I have read only the first book of this. The only closest insect-based fantasy, which besides Adrian Tchaikovsky's, the whole which like insect in books that you did, which technically was more like it was like humans who have kind of bonded with insects, and they kind of come with them. The only other insect-based fantasy which I've read or heard of is The Year of Our War by Steph Swainston, I believe. It was a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with it.
That's the only book I have heard of, which, and again, it has humans because it has immortals in it and stuff like that. So that's the only closest one. So kudos to you, sir, because this definitely sounds unique. And I'm pretty sure, all the readers and your fans will be wanting to read it and hear more about it. So we'll wait to see that. Quickly, just because I know people will want to, when you mention like, you're writing the last Manifest Solutions book, that has been, I don't want to call it a monkey on your back, but that has been something you talked about in various interviews as well. I recall when I was listening to some of your other interviews, you have mentioned that, it's something that you plan to, but you're going to take your time for it because it has to be right. Are you feeling, because you mentioned you finished kind of half of it, has the time finally come, or is it just going along?
Yeah, it's finally, it is happening. If all goes well, it might be out by the end of this year.
Oh wow.
So, but that's a maybe. But it's right now it's moving quickly. It was for sure a huge pain in the ass for me. I have started this book. This is the fourth attempt to write this. And I think the first 3 attempts, I mean, they each got close to 30,000 words before I got angry and scrapped them. A lot of, for me, like, it's gonna be weird for people, but Beyond Redemption is kind of I equate that with failure a fair amount because the book kind of it sales wise flopped to the point where like the publisher wasn't interested in more of them. And when I first started writing, I mean, the dream was traditional author, working for a publisher, selling books, writing trilogies, mad fame and fortune, all of that stuff. So in the end, it actually has turned out fairly well. I can't really complain. But that doesn't change that for me, it felt like a failure. And, so The Mirror's Truth came out. I'd already written The Mirror's Truth before I knew that it wasn't going to get picked up. When I was writing it, I was seeing all these sort of like rave reviews for Beyond Redemption and assuming that meant it was selling really well, which not the case. And then, The Mirror's Truth, basically had to publish it myself because nobody wanted it. It's done well. But I kind of, that it's stuck in my head that this series was sort of like this failure. Even though realistically, like, I got traditionally published by one of the biggest publishers on the planet. Calling that a failure is probably a little silly. So it took me a long time to find the headspace where I could kind of not think about that side of stuff and just focus on the characters and the story and get back into it. And
well, thank you for sharing that. That is definitely something profound what you just mentioned as well. Because I do remember this. You had mentioned this in one of the Wizard Warriors and Words podcast that you had started three times. But the third time is when you went back up on it. You were almost close to deleting it, but you went back and said, "Okay, this isn't so bad." And then you kind of saved some of it, and of course now you're writing it. So that is pretty cool. The Manifest Deletion series is, in a word, insane, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It is truly, because it has people who are insane, and their delusions of grandeur kind of help them along. So it will be very cool. Lastly, before we end, I do want to talk a little bit about your artwork, because besides that glorious piece right behind you, I want to talk about, because with the way you're mentioning For the Storm Beneath the World, are you potentially looking at Felix Ortiz or somebody else to do the artwork, or is it just something down the line that you're going to plan for later? Because with your Patreon, the inner sketches and everything, the way it's working out, is that just for your Patreon folks, or will that might be included in the books, maybe the hardcore editions and that?
Yep. The Patreon is doing much better than I ever dreamed. I was like, I would have been super happy if it just made enough to sort of offset a little bit of the cover art cost, because Felix is a god, but he's not a cheap god. And so the Patreon now makes enough. It's covering the cost of cover art, covering the cost of editing for one book a year. Basically it's covered, and there's money left over. And so what I'm doing is I'm illustrating everything. So I have just this last weekend finalized a deal with an illustrator. So The Storm Beneath the World is going to be an illustrated novel, not graphic novel. I'm looking at probably 10 to 12 illustrations for it. I found an artist doing some really cool stuff. So it will be illustrated. That'll be the ebook, paperback, hardcover. They're all going to be illustrated. In fact, my plan is just to be crazy. So I'm going to write it. I'm going to edit it. Get Sarah to edit it, because either way it is going to get published. I'm going to submit the edited illustrated version, and looking for agents. I'm going to see if I can find a publisher for it, just because in the background that's still always been kind of part of the dream. So I figure I'll try. And if the thing doesn't get picked up in a year or so, then I'll self-publish it, because I know it'll sell.
Yeah. Awesome. Wow. Okay. That sounds very cool. I know I can literally count on the fingers of my one hand how many people are illustrating, or at least including illustrations in their book. This is not the Kickstarter model as well. So that is very cool of you, sir. Looking forward to that, because just from the sketches that, what you have released on Patreon, those were, especially of those non-human or non-humanoid creatures, those look really cool. So I can't really, and the way what you just described, that blurb is just in my mind. Anthony Ryan's Blood Song meets Adrian Tchaikovsky's, Children of Time. That is cool. That is way, way, way cool. So I hope I'll keep my fingers crossed, as will everybody else. I hope publishers do pick it up. But if not, I'm pretty sure, your fans would devour it. Also, you can go to Brandon Sanderson Kickstarter route. I know you don't.
Honestly, I think it's amazing that he did that, and that he can do that. Now he has employees. He's not doing that by himself, right?
Oh yeah.
It's just me. I don't have anybody working for me. I can't afford to hire anybody. I can barely afford to hire me. So to pull off a Kickstarter like that, it's a lot of work. I look at what I can do just through Amazon, and I can publish good quality books with good art, interior illustrations. I can totally do it. And I don't need to ask for money up front from people in a Kickstarter. Because at this point, I know the books are going to sell. If I don't screw up, if I don't write a really crappy book, it's going to do okay. So I'm kind of more comfortable doing it this way. I would rather front the cost for stuff and then try and put out something good enough that people are going to buy it.
That's fair. That's totally fair. Yeah, talking about Brandon Sanderson, his 42 million Kickstarter, of course, has broken records, and now everybody's talking about it. Kudos to him. But of course, you're right. He had professionally developed videos which were shot on a drone, and there's so much stuff and everything. And now the only thing I feel bad about is that everybody who has already planned for a Kickstarter or is planning for a Kickstarter, now it's everybody's gonna be like, yeah, you're just doing this because Brandon Sanderson did it. They're like, no, I already had Will White of all people, poor guy, he had to put out that video and say that this was already planned. So I feel bad for that, and that reason only. Not, all kudos to Brandon Sanderson. He already is successful. Of course, he's got a lot more people now, so hopefully they'll back other Kickstarters as well. And so, all right, well, thank you so much for your time today, sir, and thank you so much for talking to me. For our viewers, we will be listing all of Michael's books, reviews in our links below, as well as his website, the Amazon page and Goodreads page. We will have a review of N to Sorrow dropping either day before or on the day of the release, which is May 15, 2022. Please keep an eye out for Michael's. If you wish to join and support Michael R. Fletcher, you can join on his Patreon. I'll be listing the link below as well. Michael, thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And do you have any last words parting words for our listeners or viewers?
No, not really. Yeah, I think we're good. But seriously, thank you for inviting me on. I really appreciate the you taking the time to sort of hang out and chat with me.
All right. Well, thank you again. Take care.